Hi guys, and welcome to another episode of Kabir Considers. In this video, I'm going to react to police officers arresting an attorney for defending his client. Now, I cannot imagine why they would do this. The only thing that comes to mind is maybe the attorney was getting extremely irate in his defense. Maybe, he encroached too much on the officer's personal space. Maybe it kind of descended into kind of like a trading of insults. I just cannot imagine why an attorney who is just defending their client in the normal manner would warrant getting arrested, because an attorney is very familiar with the law. I studied law. I'm not a lawyer, but I studied law at university. And, even the average law student from a, non-spectacular university has a pretty good understanding of the law and what would get them arrested. So for someone to, pass the bar, become a fully fledged lawyer, they're gonna know what and what not to say to a police officer. So it's gonna be quite interesting just to see exactly why this man was arrested, what justifications the officers make. It's gonna be really interesting. Let's do it. Okay. Audit the audit.
Welcome to Audit the Audit, where we sort out the who and what and the right and wrong of police interactions. This episode covers court cases, search warrants, and obstruction, and is brought to us by AL.com's channel. Be sure to check out the description below and give them the credit that they deserve. Before we dive into the episode, I want to invite you to check out the new Audit the Audit merchandise shelf just below this video. I strive to create merch that is more than just a billboard for this channel, and I personally design the graphics for all ATA products. Merch is a great way to show your support for this channel, and to show my support for this audience, I will be giving away 3 Audit the Audit shirts to randomly selected viewers who subscribe to this channel and leave a comment on this video. The raffle will end 1 week from this video being posted, so be sure to hit the subscribe button before it's too late. Now let's dive right in and audit the interaction. On February 23rd, 2017, attorneys Victor Revel and Megan Garcia were leaving the courthouse with their client, Lloyd Edwards, after appearing in court in reference to a protection from abuse order initiated by Mr. Edwards' wife, Jasmine. Before leaving the courthouse, Mr. Edwards gave 2 of his 3 cell phones to Mr. Revel. As Ms. Garcia, Mr. Revel, and Mr. Edwards exited the courthouse, they were confronted by Deputy Ashworth and Deputy Ratliff of the Blount County Sheriff's Office in Blount County, Alabama, who were attempting to serve a search warrant of Mr. Edwards and his vehicle.
I'm from the Sheriff's Office.
Take a look at it. Do you have any other weapons on your person at this time that I need to know about? RC.
No, sir.
No,
So I'm assuming that these 2 are the attorneys, and this is the individual that is being served with the papers.
Okay.
And he's reading it on his behalf.
Small pistol.
Okay. Your vehicle is also part of this search. Okay. So I'm going to have to ask you, do you have the keys to your automobile?
Yes, sir.
I need the keys to your automobile right now. Okay. Let me pat you
Why
down,
do they
make sure you
want
don't have
Why do they want to search his car though?
any other weapon. Just for your safety and ours. Okay. Just hang tight and we'll get all this resolved.
As mentioned earlier in the video, Mr. Edwards was appearing in court about a protection order issued by his wife. Mrs. Edwards alleged that Mr. Edwards had abused her and their daughter, and testified that Mr. Edwards' cell phones contained proof of her claims. Mrs. Edwards' testimony led the prosecution to pursue a search warrant for Mr. Edwards' person and vehicle.
I see. So they're trying to obtain the phone to get the evidence that Mrs. Edwards, alleges exists.
Specifically targeting his 3 cell phones.
Right.
I called the Revel law firm, and Mr. Revel stated that there was no evidence of abuse on the phones, and that the phones actually contained evidence that supported Mr. Edwards' innocence.
Oh,
Mr.
wow.
Revel claims that Mrs. Edwards had exchanged explicit messages with Mr. Edwards, which indicated that her interactions with him were consensual, and that he intended to submit the phones as evidence for the defense. Mr. Edwards later stated that Mr. Revel told him that, quote, "There may come a day when the prosecution wants your phone," and one of the attorneys asked him for the 2 phones just before exiting the courtroom. room. The phones were then placed into Mrs. Garcia's briefcase prior to exiting the building.
Okay. So now she's in possession of the cell phones. Does that give the officers, because she's in possession of the phones now, do the officers have, the right to get the phones from her, even though they are Mr. Edwards' phones? I'm guessing that's what causes the arrest.
His person.
I'm guessing she refuses to give the phones to the officers.
That's correct.
And for his vehicle.
That's correct.
So he has given the phone that's on his person.
Okay, I have video of him handing the phone to you.
Yeah, they're not going to want to give the phones up.
Yeah, you all do have that, but that is not on. When you all
No, I'm
came
out
on
here at
him
the courthouse
to serve
with
this
Brian on
warrant,
the search
that was
warrant.
not on his person. So you all are not entitled to that.
I see. They're not wanting to surrender the phones because, to be fair, if they give the officers the phones, who's to say that the evidence that Mr. Edwards has that's going to clear him of these charges, these allegations, could get destroyed or misplaced and affect his case, the outcome?
Well, I can. We'll go the other route to get that other phone.
As Mr. Revel mentioned, the language of the search warrant dictates that the search may be performed on Mr. Edwards' immediate person and vehicle only. Since Mr. Edwards was not in possession of the phones at the time of the warrant being served, the deputies are not entitled to them. If the deputies had acquired a search warrant for the phones themselves, then they may have had some authority to seize them, but the validity of such a search warrant would be questionable, considering that the defense also intends to submit the phones as evidence. The search warrant presented by the officers does not authorize them to search Mrs. Garcia, but the prosecution does have a trick up its sleeve, which we will discuss later in the video. After realizing that Mr. Revel is refusing to comply with the search, Deputy Ashworth calls the district attorney's office for advice on how to proceed.
All right, you just got to apply.
Okay, we're standing here, and we have it on video that he handed his cell phone to his attorney, one, and they handed it to another, and it's in the satchel that is right here.
Well, are we being detained?
I mean, yeah, if they're not being detained, they don't have to stand there and wait for them to get the appropriate warrant. Like, they can just leave, no?
At this moment in time,
They're not denying it. We have it on video.
I'm going to detain you until we determine the next course of action. Give me
Well,
just a minute.
I have this
Okay.
person and vehicle.
What? They're being detained?
I'm going to turn this off. I don't know what we just done.
This doesn't seem right.
Okay.
So they just have to stand here and wait for the warrant to come through so they can get searched and the phone seized.
Okay. We either need the phone out of the satchel, or we will have to detain you and give search warrant to get the phone.
So you're going to okay. Well, we're not going to give you we're not going to give you anything that's on our person that you don't have a right to. So if you detain us, you have to have certain constitutional safeguards to do that. But if you're going to detain us, then hey, we're not going to run. So and you all are telling us we are being detained. Is that right?
At this point in time right now, you are being detained. Now,
I really hope this guy has made copies of the text messages, and sent them to his computer or something, because evidence tampering does happen.
they determine
Okay. You both are under arrest for obstructing government operations.
Obstructing government operations.
That's correct.
Mr. Ashworth.
This is definitely an unlawful arrest. But we're under arrest. We're under arrest.
Mr. Revel is more than correct that this arrest is unlawful. Not only are the deputies charging Mr. Revel under the authority of an irrelevant search warrant, but neither Mr. Revel or Mrs. Garcia did anything that would constitute a violation of Alabama Code 13A-10-2. The code states that a person commits the crime of obstructing governmental operations if, by means of intimidation, physical force, or interference, intentionally obstructs the administration of law or prevents a public servant from performing a governmental function. Neither Mr. Revel nor Mrs. Garcia conducted themselves in a manner that was intimidating, physically forceful, or interfering.
They've literally just stood there and politely answered the questions. Who is this lady? Is she the lawyer? Is she one of the lawyers for Mrs. Edwards? Like, we've not had any real clarification as to who she is.
They both simply stated that they would not comply with the deputies' unlawful orders. They did nothing to prevent the deputies from seizing the phone. If the deputies were so sure that the search warrant authorized them to seize the phones, then what was stopping them from taking Mrs. Garcia's bag and getting them?
By
Certainly
force,
not
yeah.
Mr. Revel or Mrs. Garcia.
Yeah, real life.
I'm not sure what I'm trouble for. I don't understand it.
Sir, if you would turn around and make sure you don't have no
Wow.
Of course not.
Okay.
This is ridiculous.
We have it on video.
We have not broken the law. So if you're arresting us,
I mean, this is just like, because now they could they not sue for, like, you know, reputational damage, stuff like that? You know, they'd probably win, which would cost the department money, taxpayers' money. Like,
I'm being arrested for obstructing government operations.
That's correct.
Let me take out this.
because him being filmed being arrested could do damage to his career.
Real life. Y'all want to arrest two lawyers for this charge? You sure you
Are
want
you
to do this?
subject to the law?
I am subject to the law.
Are you ready?
Okay. And this is, who are you?
I'm Sue Ashworth.
Sue Ashworth.
That's correct.
Sue
Brian
Ashworth.
Ratliff.
And you're arresting us under her orders?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Deputy Ratliff, I want to make sure that you know from our position was that this search warrant,
The warrant doesn't entitle you to the phones. It's as simple as that. Like,
this warrant was given to him after he gave us some things for us to use in his defense. And so we did not do anything to keep you all from doing you all's job. Now, if you all want to
I'm out
take
here
this
with
satchel and go
the
through
sheriff's
and do it,
office at the courthouse.
we're not preventing you from
doing a search warrant on the car. And
the sheriff's department's probably going to have to issue like a pretty groveling apology to this guy and this lady.
I'm out here just
From the moment he's entered the courthouse, he's been under surveillance. Okay? For the reasons of this search warrant. Alright? I've sat here and watched you and him and her.
can't wait to get about 10 or 15 minutes. I'll be ready.
You looked up. As a matter of fact, you did look up at the camera 2 or 3 times. He pulled the phone out and handed it to you. You handed it back to him. He was fooling with, I'm guessing, a
I just
password.
want to keep you on the line.
And after a short period of time, he handed it back to you. You handed it to her. She put it in here. Okay?
How is this
That
relevant?
is evidence for this search warrant.
Like, what he just said just isn't really relevant. At the end of the day, she is now in possession of the phones. The warrant pertains to this man here. Like, phones in his, possession. Like, if he doesn't have the phones, the warrant is void.
And you agree with me that you all served this search warrant on him subsequent to that, after that, right? Yeah. After we left out the building.
Yes.
The deputies failed to understand the authoritative limitations of the search warrant,
Right.
and Mr. Revel and Mrs. Garcia were arrested and charged under Code 13A-10-2. The prosecution
dropped.
initially offered to drop the charges if Mr. Revel agreed to write a letter apologizing and admitting that the deputies did nothing wrong.
No.
But Mr. Revel rejected their offer
Absolutely.
and decided to proceed with a trial.
Yeah, absolutely. Why would he apologize? What for?
In the ensuing criminal trial, Mr. Revel and Mrs. Garcia's defense argued that the state failed to establish the defendant's intent and that no crime was committed because the search warrant did not authorize the search of Mr. Edwards' attorneys. The prosecution argued that they were entitled to the phones under the exigent circumstances doctrine, which is a legal precedent that allows for warrantless searches in circumstances where evidence has a high likelihood of being destroyed, such as cell phone data. I have covered the exigent circumstances doctrine in a previous video, which I will link in the info card above. During the trial, Mr. Edwards, who was still under investigation at the time, testified for the prosecution, but stated that District Attorney Casey tried to prep him in his testimony, even though she had reportedly recused herself from the case, and Mr. Edwards became a key witness for Mr. Revel's defense. Ultimately, Judge King acquitted Mr. Revel and Mrs. Garcia.
Absolutely. Well done, Judge.
Of all charges and stated that the deputies were wrong about the authority of the search warrant and that the defendants never physically prevented the deputies from carrying out their duties. Mr. Revel and Mrs. Garcia were forced to recuse themselves from Mr. Edwards' case after filing 2 separate federal lawsuits against.
Of course. I mean, I knew that they would file a lawsuit. I knew it. Why would you not? You know, because it definitely could cause loss of earnings via reputational damage.
Against Deputy Ratliff and Deputy Ashworth, as well as District Attorney Casey and the Assistant District Attorney Scott Gilliland. It is worth noting that Mr. Edwards has yet to go to trial, and his case has been reset by a different grand jury several times over the past 2 years.
Really?
It is highly irregular for a district attorney to delay indictment when the suspect has been charged, and there is merit to the notion that she may be delaying Mr. Edwards' prosecution so that she can use his pending case as leverage against him for his testimony in the federal lawsuit against her. Nonetheless, Mr. Revel is optimistic about the case and told me that he expects to reach a settlement agreement with certain undisclosed stipulations. Overall, the deputies and district attorneys of the Blount County Sheriff's Office get an F for exaggerating the authority of a search warrant, violating Mr. Revel and Mrs. Garcia.
It seemed like she was really, like, she kind of had a bit of a chip on her shoulder. She just really, really wanted to, like, stamp, like, unjustified, you know, authority, like, on those 2 attorneys. Like, even the way she was answering the questions were very kind of, like, inflammatory. This guy here just didn't really seem to understand, you know, what he was doing.
Garcia's Fourth Amendment rights and falsely arresting them for obstruction. At one point in the video, Deputy Ashworth states that she is detaining Mr. Revel and Mrs. Garcia until she is able to acquire a search warrant. And she may have had the authority to do that under the exigent circumstance doctrine. If Deputy Ashworth had stuck to that plan, she may have been able to legally seize the phones, but she instead chose to escalate the detainment to an arrest, rather than waiting for a proper search warrant. The phones were eventually searched by the prosecution, but they did not contain any usable evidence. And even if they had, the prosecution would not have been able to submit them as evidence in the trial against Mr. Edwards because the phones were illegally obtained. The only thing that the prosecution got out of this interaction was a federal lawsuit that will likely result in a hefty settlement. Mr. Revel gets an A+ for having the mental agility and conversational fortitude to dispute the validity of the search warrant and the courage and conviction to defend his personal liberty and stand by his defendant's rights. Mr. Revel immediately knew that the arrest was unlawful and offered the deputies multiple opportunities to reconsider. There is no doubt that Mr. Revel and Mrs. Garcia will walk away from this case with a victory, and any client would be lucky to have their representation. Mr. Revel deserves recognition for his conduct during this interaction, and I will leave a link to the Revel Law Firm's website in the description below for anyone in Alabama who may be interested in seeking their services. Let us know if there is an interaction or legal topic you would like us to cover in the comments below.
Yeah, I honestly, just a complete mess. Like, well done to Mr. Revel, like that attorney. He just handled it with complete competency. Like, he knew exactly, you know, his rights and, you know, what justified an arrest, and this did not, you know, justify an arrest. You know, the actions of the DA and the officer, you know, have just cost that state a bunch of money for no reason. Like, just pretty much ignorance, really, ignorance of the law. You've just wasted a bunch of taxpayers' money, you know, that could have been used for something actually worthy of it. Just ridiculous, you know, like that Mr. Edwards. And in the end, like, they took the phones and there was nothing on the phones. So after all that, after everything we saw on the video, after the settlement is inevitably paid to Mr. Revel and Mrs. Garcia, there was no usable evidence. It's just a complete mess. Great video though. Let me know what you guys think. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.